The application landed on Colonel Harrison Vance's desk at 0600, and by 0602 his laughter echoed through battalion headquarters at Fort Campbell. He held the paper between two fingers like it carried contamination and turned to his executive officer with the expression of a man who had just discovered something genuinely amusing. A female logistics specialist wanted to try out for Ranger assessment. Major Sinclair stood at parade rest and said nothing while the colonel read the name aloud. Staff Sergeant Yolanda Achebe, 29 years old, 6 years in the Army. Not a single day in a combat military occupational specialty. Vance dropped the application on his desk and leaned back in his chair. In 24 years, he had seen plenty of delusional requests cross this desk, but this one took the prize. She pushed papers in a warehouse, and she thought she could earn a Ranger tab. Before we continue with Yolanda's journey, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you know someone who had to fight twice as hard just to get a seat at the table. 3 buildings away, Staff Sergeant Yolanda Achebe finished her morning accountability report and checked time. She had submitted the application 48 hours ago through proper channels. The automated system showed it had been received and forwarded to battalion command. Now she waited. She had been waiting for 6 years in one form or another, so another few days meant nothing. The supply warehouse hummed with activity around her as junior soldiers moved pallets and checked inventory against manifests. Private First Class Damon Yates approached her workstation with a clipboard and a confused expression. Sergeant Achebe, he said, I cannot get these numbers to match. Someone signed for 47 sets of body armor, but I only count 44 in the cage. Yolanda took the clipboard and scanned the entries. Her eyes moved with precision across the columns. Show me the cage, she said, and Yates led her through the rows of shelving to the secure storage area. She counted the armor herself, then checked the serial numbers against the log. 3 had been transferred to Charlie Company last week, she said. The paperwork is filed under equipment loans, not permanent transfers. Check tab 7 in the binder. Yates found the documentation exactly where she said it would be, and his shoulders relaxed. Thank you, Sergeant, he said. I've been staring at this for an hour. Yolanda handed back the clipboard. Next time, check the loan log first, she said. It will save you the headache. She watched him walk away with renewed confidence and allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. Teaching soldiers to solve problems mattered, even if the problems involved spreadsheets instead of combat. By 1400, the response arrived in her inbox. Application denied. Insufficient combat experience and non-qualifying military occupational specialty. The rejection carried Colonel Vance's digital signature and a form paragraph about maintaining standards. Yolanda read it twice, then closed the email. Her face revealed nothing. Around her, the warehouse continued its operations, and no one noticed that anything had changed. She finished her shift and completed her reports and walked back to the barracks as the Kentucky sun dropped toward the tree line. Her room was small and regulation clean. She locked the door and sat on the edge of her rack and opened the footlocker at the end of her bed. Beneath folded uniforms and a stack of fitness magazines lay a worn book with a green canvas cover. The Ranger Handbook. She lifted it carefully and opened to the first page where handwriting filled the margins. Her father's handwriting. Staff Sergeant Marcus Achebe had carried this book through 3 deployments before the training accident that killed him when Yolanda was 16. His notes covered every page. Observations about terrain and tactics. Reminders about mental discipline. Small drawings that illustrated patrol formations. She traced one of his notes with her fingertip. The mind quits before the body, he had written. Never let it. She had joined the Army 2 years after his funeral. The recruiter at the strip mall office had listened to her goals and shaken his head with something like pity. Women do not go to Ranger school, he had told her. That is just how it is. He had steered her toward logistics, and she had been young enough and grieving enough to accept it. 6 years later, she understood how much that acceptance had cost her. But she also understood something the recruiter never could. The mind quits before the body, and hers had not quit yet. She closed the handbook and returned it to the footlocker. Then she opened her laptop and began typing a formal appeal. The regulation allowed for one appeal within 30 days of denial. She cited her physical fitness scores, which exceeded male standards in every category. She cited her 6 years of flawless service. She cited the recent policy changes that had opened combat roles to women across the force. She wrote until midnight and revised until 0200 and submitted the appeal at 0300 before her alarm would wake her from morning physical training. At 0400, she ran alone through the dark streets of Fort Campbell, 5 miles at a 7-minute pace, then pull-ups on the bar behind a motor pool, then flutter kicks until her abdomen burned. She had followed this routine for 3 years, and no one in her chain of command knew about it. The official physical training with her unit started at 0630, and she completed that too. 2 workouts before most soldiers finish one. Her father's handbook called this embracing the suck. She called it preparation. The appeal landed on 2 desks simultaneously. Captain Lucia Brennan in the Judge Advocate General's office received her copy at 0800. Colonel Vance received his copy at 0805. Brennan was a JAG officer who believed in regulations over personalities. She read the appeal with professional interest and noted the soldier's qualifications. Then she opened a separate file that had arrived from Colonel Vance's office the previous afternoon. A memorandum recommending that Staff Sergeant Achebe be flagged for insubordination and transferred to a different battalion before she could waste any more command time with frivolous requests. Brennan set both documents side by side and studied them. Someone was about to have a very difficult conversation with battalion command. She had not yet decided whose side she would take, but she knew one thing for certain. This situation was far from over. Captain Lucia Brennan had seen plenty of grudge matches play out through Army paperwork, but the documents on her desk suggested something more deliberate. Colonel Vance's memorandum requesting Achebe's transfer had been drafted 6 hours before the soldier even submitted her appeal. He had anticipated her response and moved to cut her off at the knees. Brennan pulled up Achebe's service record and scrolled through 6 years of evaluations. Every single one rated her as exceeds standards or above. Her physical fitness scores placed her in the top 3% of all soldiers at Fort Campbell regardless of gender. 3 separate commanders had recommended her for leadership schools. 3 times those recommendations had been denied at battalion level. Brennan checked the signature authority on each denial. Colonel Harrison Vance. He had been blocking this woman's career advancement for 2 years, and the paper trail proved it. Sergeant First Class Derek Okonkwo found Yolanda in the warehouse during lunch hours when most soldiers disappeared to the dining facility. She stood alone in the cage, running inventory counts she had already completed twice that morning. He recognized the behavior. When Yolanda Achebe could not control something important, she controlled everything else with ferocious precision. He leaned against the chain link and waited until she acknowledged him. They denied it, she said, without looking up. Her voice carried no emotion, but Okonkwo had known her long enough to hear what lay beneath the flat tone. He was a tall man with graying temples and a Nigerian accent that decades in America had softened but never erased. 22 years in the Army had taught him patience and the value of choosing words carefully. I heard he said. The colonel was laughing about it at the command meeting this morning. Yolanda's hand paused over the clipboard for just a moment before resuming its work. She asked if he had said anything specific. Okonkwo moved closer and lowered his voice. He called it a publicity stunt, said you were trying to make a point instead of being a soldier. Yolanda set down the clipboard and finally met his eyes. The anger there burned cold and controlled. Then I will have to show him the difference, she said. Okonkwo had watched over Yolanda since she arrived at Fort Campbell 4 years ago. He had served with her father briefly at Fort Benning in 2008 before Marcus Achebe transferred to the unit where he would die. The connection had never been spoken aloud between them, but Okonkwo suspected she knew. He had covered for her early morning training sessions and said nothing when she returned from runs that would have broken most infantry soldiers. Now he made a decision that had been building for months. Your father talked about you, he said. Yolanda went still. Before every jump, he would show the newer guys your photo. Tell them about his daughter, who was smarter than all of them combined. Said you're going to do something important someday. He just did not know what yet. Yolanda's throat tightened, but her expression held steady. She had learned long ago that tears in uniform invited questions she did not want to answer. He never told me that, she said. Okonkwo shrugged. Marcus was not good at saying soft things out loud, but he wrote you letters. I saw him writing them every week. Did you ever get them? She shook her head. He died before he could send the last ones. My mother found a stack of them in his belongings, but they were addressed to an old apartment. We never recovered them. The silence between them filled with 13 years of grief that neither could fully express. Finally, Okonkwo straightened and checked his watch. I need to get back, he said. But Yolanda, whatever you are planning to do next, do it smart. The colonel has been in this army a long time. He knows how to bury people in paperwork. That evening, Yolanda changed into civilian clothes and drove to the legal assistance office on the other side of post. Captain Brennan had requested a meeting through official channels, which meant the JAG officer had found something worth discussing. The office was quiet at 1730 when most soldiers had gone home for the day. Brennan sat behind her desk with 2 folders open and an expression that suggested she had spent the afternoon making difficult calculations. Have a seat, Staff Sergeant, she said. Yolanda sat at attention in the wooden chair and waited. Brennan turned one folder to face her. This is your service record, she said. It is exceptional. 6 years of top ratings. Physical fitness scores that exceed Ranger minimums. Leadership potential noted by every commander except the current one. She turned the second folder. And this is a pattern of obstruction that borders on unlawful command influence. Colonel Vance has denied you 3 school slots in 2 years. Each denial overrode a direct recommendation from your company commander. Each denial cited vague concerns about unit readiness that do not appear anywhere else in battalion records. Yolanda studied the documents while her pulse quickened. She had suspected bias, but seeing it documented felt like confirmation of something she had known in her bones. What can I do with this, she asked. Brennan leaned back in her chair. Officially, my role is to advise you on regulations and available remedies. Unofficially, I am telling you that Colonel Vance has made an enemy of the wrong soldier. Your appeal has merit. More importantly, there are regulations he has violated in his handling of your career. But here is the problem. She checked her watch. He submitted a transfer request this morning. If it goes through before your appeal is processed, you will be at a new duty station, and this entire file becomes someone else's problem. Yolanda felt the walls closing in. How long do I have, she asked. Brennan gathered the folders and stood. 72 hours. Maybe less. I need to find someone above Vance who cares enough to intervene. That means going to brigade level, which means exposing battalion command to scrutiny they will not appreciate. She met Yolanda's eyes. Are you prepared for what happens if we win this fight? The colonel will not forget, and he will not forgive. Yolanda thought about her father's handbook and the notes he had left behind. She thought about 6 years of being told what she could not do. She thought about every woman who would come after her and face the same barriers. I have been preparing my whole life, she said. Brennan nodded once. Then we have work to do. The next 48 hours dissolved into a blur of documents and whispered conversations. Captain Brennan worked through the night, assembling a case file that documented every irregularity in Colonel Vance's handling of Yolanda's career. She cross-referenced denial letters with battalion readiness reports and found no correlation between the stated reasons and actual unit needs. She pulled promotion board records and discovered that Vance had personally intervened to remove Yolanda's name from a fast-track list 18 months ago. The evidence painted a picture of systematic obstruction that went beyond professional disagreement into something that looked very much like discrimination. Yolanda continued her duties in the warehouse while her future hung in the balance. She trained at 0400 as always and reported to work at 0630 as always and gave no indication that anything unusual was happening. The discipline required to maintain that facade cost her more than any physical exercise ever had. On the second night, she sat in Brennan's office until midnight reviewing documents and rehearsing answers to questions that might never be asked. "What brigade command sides with Vance?" she asked. Brennan did not sugarcoat the answer. "Then you transfer to a new battalion and start over. Your record follows you. Eventually, you find a commander who sees your potential instead of your gender. It is not fair, but it is reality." Yolanda absorbed this without comment. Fair had never been part of her vocabulary. On the morning of the third day, Major Theodore Sinclair arrived at the JAG office before sunrise. He was Colonel Vance's executive officer, and his presence in this building at this hour could end his career if the wrong person noticed. Brennan met him at the door and led him to a conference room with no windows. Yolanda waited inside, already seated and rigidly professional. The major looked tired in a way that suggested sleepless nights and difficult decisions. He sat across from them and placed a folder on the table. "I'm not here," he said. "Officially, I am at the gym for PT. Whatever happens in this room, I will deny if asked directly. Do you understand?" Both women nodded. Sinclair opened the folder and removed a stack of papers. "These are memoranda from Colonel Vance's files," he said. "I have access to his correspondence as XO. These documents show a pattern of communication with other battalion commanders advising them to reject female applicants for combat-related schools. He has been building a network of like-minded officers who share his views on women in the military." Brennan took the papers and scanned them with growing disbelief. "This goes beyond one soldier," she said. "This is coordinated policy in direct violation of Department of Defense directives." Sinclair nodded. "I joined the Army to serve my country, not to participate in discrimination. Colonel Vance is a decorated officer, and I have respected him for many years. But this is wrong." He looked at Yolanda directly. "Staff Sergeant, your case is not isolated. You are simply the first one to fight back with documentation." The meeting lasted an hour. When it ended, Sinclair left through a back entrance, and Brennan began drafting a formal complaint to Brigade Command. The evidence now extended far beyond one denied application. They had uncovered a conspiracy that implicated multiple officers across 3 battalions. Yolanda understood that she had become something larger than herself. Her fight was no longer about earning a Ranger tab. It was about breaking a system designed to keep women like her in their place. Colonel Vance learned of the brigade inquiry at 1400 that afternoon. First Sergeant Raymond Cobb delivered the news in the privacy of the battalion commander's office. "Sir," he said, "Brigade is asking questions about female soldier assignments. They want records going back 3 years." Vance's expression hardened, but his voice remained steady. "Who initiated this inquiry?" Cobb hesitated. "The paperwork traces back to a JAG complaint filed on behalf of Staff Sergeant Achebe. But, sir, the scope suggests they're looking at more than just her case." Vance stood and walked to his window, overlooking the battalion footprint. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he turned back to Cobb. "Schedule a battalion PT test for tomorrow morning. All soldiers, every company. I want Staff Sergeant Achebe front and center where everyone can see her." Cobb frowned. "Sir, a full battalion test requires 48 hours notice minimum." Vance smiled without warmth. "Then notify them now. If this soldier wants to prove she belongs in special operations, she can start by proving she belongs in my battalion." Word spread through the unit within hours. A surprise PT test meant someone had angered command, and everyone would pay the price. Yolanda heard the whispers and understood immediately. Vance was trying to humiliate her publicly. He expected her to fail, or at minimum to perform below the male soldiers, and give him ammunition for his case. He did not know that she had been training to Ranger standards for 3 years. He did not know that his test would become her platform. She slept 6 hours that night and woke at 0300 to stretch and hydrate. By 0500, she stood in formation with 800 other soldiers on the battalion PT field. Floodlights illuminated the grass, and the January cold bit through their uniform shorts and shirts. Colonel Vance himself stood on the reviewing platform, flanked by First Sergeant Cobb and several company commanders. His eyes found Yolanda in the formation and held for a long moment. The test began with push-ups. Yolanda completed 87 in 2 minutes, while the male standard required 60. Then sit-ups where she reached 92 against a standard of 65. Then the 2-mile run where she crossed the finish line in 12 minutes and 40 seconds. The male minimum was 15:36. She had not simply passed. She had demolished every metric while senior leadership watched. When the final times were posted, her name sat at the top of the battalion roster. First place overall. Not first among women. First among everyone. Cobb studied the results with an expression Yolanda could not read. He had served 20 years in the infantry, including 2 Ranger deployments. He knew what physical excellence looked like. Vance stood beside him reviewing the same numbers. His face revealed nothing, but Yolanda noticed his jaw tighten. She had taken his weapon and turned it against him. Now the entire battalion knew what she was capable of. That evening Brennan called with news. Brigade Command had received their complaint and Sinclair's documentation. An investigation was formally underway. More importantly, the transfer request had been frozen pending review. Yolanda was not going anywhere. And then Brennan added something else. A message had arrived from division headquarters. Deployment orders. The entire battalion was shipping to Afghanistan in 30 days. Everything else, including Ranger applications and discrimination investigations, would be placed on indefinite hold. Yolanda set down the phone and stared at the wall of her small room. She had won the battle and lost the war in the same moment. Deployment preparation consumed Fort Campbell like a fever. Soldiers who had spent months in routine training now scrambled to certify weapons qualifications and update wills and sit through endless briefings about rules of engagement. The investigation into Colonel Vance's conduct was formally suspended pending the unit's return from Afghanistan. Captain Brennan delivered this news to Yolanda in person. Her expression carried genuine frustration. The Army does not stop wars for discrimination complaints, she said. But the file will be waiting when you get back. Everything we gathered is preserved. Yolanda nodded and thanked her and walked back to the warehouse where pallets of equipment waited to be inventoried for overseas shipment. She had learned long ago that disappointment was just another obstacle to train through. Sergeant First Class Okonkwo found her that evening in the motor pool checking vehicle load plans against manifest requirements. The sun had set an hour ago, but she worked under floodlights with the focus of someone who needed distraction. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "You know these load plans are not your responsibility," he said. "The transportation NCO has a whole team for this." Yolanda did not look up from her clipboard. "I know," she said, "but if something gets left behind because of a paperwork error, soldiers could die. I would rather check twice than attend a memorial." Okonkwo stepped closer and gently took the clipboard from her hands. She finally met his eyes. They were red with exhaustion and something deeper. "Talk to me," he said. She exhaled slowly and leaned against the hood of a cargo truck. "The investigation is frozen," she said. "Vance wins by default. We deploy, and when we come back, he will have 12 months to bury everything we built." Okonkwo set down the clipboard and stood beside her. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe Afghanistan gives you something investigation never could." Yolanda frowned. "What do you mean?" He turned to face her directly. "Your father earned his Ranger tab through combat performance. He was a supply sergeant, too, before he won a selection. Did you know that?" She shook her head. "He never told me." Okonkwo smiled slightly. Marcus Achebe spent 4 years pushing paper before deployment, gave him the chance to show what he was really made of. One mission changed everything. Sometimes the Army needs to see you under fire before it believes what you can do. The words settled into her chest like stones dropped in still water. She had spent 6 years trying to earn her opportunity through proper channels. Perhaps the opportunity had been waiting in the wrong place all along. She retrieved the clipboard and handed it back to Okonkwo. "I need to train harder," she said. He nodded. "I know a place where we can work on land navigation without anyone asking questions. The ranges behind the engineer compound stay empty after 2200. She almost smiled. "Are you offering to help me train for something I might never get to attempt?" Okonkwo shrugged. "I made a promise to your father once. Took me a long time to figure out how to keep it." The final week before deployment passed in a blur of equipment checks and family farewells. Yolanda had no family to notify. Her mother had passed 3 years ago, and she had no siblings. The only person who received a letter was the manager of a storage unit in Georgia, where her father's belongings still waited in boxes she had never been able to open. She wrote simply that she was deploying and that if something happened, the unit should be cleared and donated to veteran services. She did not write that she hoped to finally understand who her father had really been by walking the same ground he once walked. Colonel Vance held his final stateside briefing in the battalion theater. 800 soldiers filled the seats while he stood at the podium and delivered remarks about honor and sacrifice and the importance of their mission. His eyes swept the crowd with practiced authority. Yolanda sat in the third row where logistics personnel had been assigned. When his gaze passed over her, it lingered for just a moment. She held his stare without blinking. He looked away first. After the briefing, First Sergeant Cobb intercepted her outside the theater. "Staff Sergeant Achebe," he said. "A word." She followed him to a quiet corner away from the flowing crowd of soldiers. Cobb studied her with an expression she could not read. "I saw your PT scores," he said, "and I pulled your range qualifications from last month. Expert on every weapon system." She waited for the criticism that usually followed any acknowledgement of her abilities. Cobb surprised her. "I do not know what you're trying to prove or who you are trying to prove it to," he said, "but I know what readiness looks like. Whatever happens over there, keep your head down and do your job. Opportunities find soldiers who are prepared for them." He walked away before she could respond. The night before departure, Yolanda sat alone in her barracks room with her father's Ranger handbook open on her lap. She had read every page 100 times, but tonight the words felt different. Her father had written notes about Afghanistan in the margins, observations about terrain and weather, and the particular challenges of operating in mountain environments. He had deployed to the same region where she was now heading. She traced his handwriting with her fingertip and felt something shift inside her chest. This was not just a deployment. It was a pilgrimage. Private First Class Yates knocked on her door at 2200 to ask a question about equipment packing. She answered his question and then noticed the fear barely hidden behind his young eyes. He was 21 and had never deployed. She invited him inside and spent an hour telling him what to expect based on the account her father had shared years ago. When he left, he looked steadier. At the door, he turned back. "Sergeant Achebe," he said, "thank you for always taking time to help me. I know you have bigger things to worry about." She shook her head. "There is nothing bigger than making sure soldiers come home," she said. "Remember that." She reached in her pocket and pulled out a worn bronze coin, her father's challenge coin from his Ranger battalion. She pressed it into Yates's palm. "Carry this," she said. "Bring it back to me when we get home." He looked at the coin with something like reverence. "I will, Sergeant," he said. "I promise." The C-17 lifted off from Campbell Army Airfield at 0600 the next morning. Yolanda watched Kentucky disappear beneath the clouds and felt the weight of everything she was leaving behind. The investigation, the application, the life she had built in a place that had never fully accepted her. Ahead lay Afghanistan and whatever opportunities or dangers it held. She closed her eyes and heard her father's voice reading from his handbook. The mind quits before the body. She would not quit. She would not stop. And when she returned, she would have more than paperwork to prove her worth. The first mortar round hit FOB Sharana at 0347 on their third night in country. Yolanda was already awake reviewing supply manifests when the explosion shook the walls of the logistics building. She moved before thinking, grabbed her vest and helmet from the hook beside her desk, and ran toward the sound of chaos rather than away from it. Outside, the sky flickered orange with secondary fires, and soldiers scrambled in every direction, shouting orders and questions into the darkness. A second round landed near the vehicle park and sent shrapnel singing through the air. She heard someone screaming for a medic near the entry control point. She found 3 soldiers pinned behind a concrete barrier. One was bleeding from the shoulder where debris had torn through his uniform. The other 2 were frozen with the paralysis of those experiencing combat for the first time. Yolanda grabbed the wounded soldier under his arms and shouted at the others to move. They followed her voice without question as she dragged the casualty toward the aid station 50 meters away. A third mortar round landed somewhere behind them, and the concussion knocked her sideways, but she kept her grip and kept moving. By the time she reached the aid station, the medics were already overwhelmed with casualties. She applied pressure to the shoulder wound until a corpsman could take over, then went back out to find more wounded. The attack lasted 11 minutes. When the all-clear sounded, Yolanda had helped move 6 casualties to the aid station and directed a dozen disoriented soldiers to their rally points. Her uniform was soaked with someone else's blood, and her hands trembled with adrenaline she could not yet process. She found a quiet corner behind the communications building and sat down on an ammunition crate and focused on breathing until her heart rate slowed. This was real. Everything she had trained for and imagined and prepared herself to face. This was what it actually felt like. Colonel Vance observed the after-action review from the back of the briefing room. The battalion operations officer walked through the timeline of the attack and identified failures in early warning response. Vance listened without expression until the briefing concluded. Then he approached the company commander whose sector had taken the most casualties. "I want names," he said. "Every soldier who performed well under fire. I want to know who kept their heads." The captain consulted his notes and listed several names. He hesitated before adding one more. "Staff Sergeant Achebe from Logistics, sir. She was one of the first responders. Helped evacuate 6 wounded before the medics could establish a collection point." Vance's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He said nothing and walked away. The following weeks settled into the grinding rhythm of deployed operations. Yolanda ran the forward logistics element with precision that drew reluctant praise from officers who had never noticed her before. She coordinated supply convoys through hostile territory and tracked equipment readiness across 3 company areas and solved problems before they became crises. Her days started at 0500 and ended well past midnight. But she still found time to train. Early morning runs around the FOB perimeter. Pull-ups on a bar welded to a shipping container. Combat drills with Okonkwo in the empty hours before dawn. He pushed her harder than any instructor ever had. Land navigation by starlight. Casualty evacuation under simulated fire. Hand-to-hand techniques adapted for smaller frames against larger opponents. She absorbed everything with the hunger of someone who understood that knowledge might mean survival. One night, after a particularly brutal session, she asked him why he was doing this. Why he had invested so much in someone else's impossible dream. Okonkwo sat down on a sandbag wall and looked up at the Afghan stars. "Your father saved my life," once he said. Mosul in 2007. "We were ambushed and I took a round in the leg. Could not move. Marcus came back for me when everyone else had pushed forward. Carried me 400 meters under fire to the casualty collection point." She had never heard this story. Her father had never spoken about his deployments in detail. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked. He shrugged. "Some things are hard to say out loud. Easier to show through actions." He turned to look at her directly. "Your father saw something in people that others missed. He saw potential where everyone else saw limitations. I think he would see the same thing in you if he were here." The next morning, Yolanda found herself summoned to the Battalion Tactical Operations Center. Colonel Vance stood over a map table with First Sergeant Cobb and several company commanders. He did not acknowledge her arrival for nearly a minute. Finally, he looked up. "Staff Sergeant Achebe," he said, "your logistics work has been acceptable." She recognized the word he had chosen, the same dismissive term he had used in her evaluation 3 years ago. She said nothing. Vance continued, "We have reports of enemy buildup in the Bermal Valley. A patrol is being assembled to investigate. I need someone who knows our supply routes through that sector. Someone who can coordinate emergency resupply if the patrol makes contact." He paused and his eyes met hers. "You will remain here at the operations center and provide radio support. Nothing more." She understood immediately. He was keeping her close enough to use her skills, but far enough from action to deny her any opportunity for distinction. She replied with the only words available. "Yes, sir." That night, a patrol of 18 soldiers departed through the wire and headed toward the valley. Private First Class Yates was among them. Yolanda watched the convoy lights disappear into the darkness and felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Okonkwo appeared beside her. He said nothing, but his presence offered comfort. 8 hours later, the radio crackled with a transmission that changed everything. Contact. Heavy contact. Patrol pinned down. Casualties mounting. Request immediate support. The operations center erupted into controlled chaos. Yolanda listened to the desperate voices on the radio and tracked their position on the map and felt her hands begin to shake. Yates was out there. The soldiers she had trained beside and served with for months were out there, and she was stuck behind walls watching icons on a screen. Vance's voice cut through the noise. Prepare a quick reaction force. We're going to get our people back. First Sergeant Cobb began assembling personnel. Yolanda stepped forward. Sir, she said, I know those supply routes better than anyone. I can guide the QRF through terrain that will cut 30 minutes off the approach. Vance turned to face her. His expression was stone. You will remain at your post, Staff Sergeant. That is an order. He walked away before she could respond. The QRF departed 20 minutes later without her. She stood at the radio and listened to the sounds of a battle she could not join and prayed to whatever power might listen that the soldiers she cared about would survive the night. The radio transmissions grew more desperate as the hours passed. The Quick Reaction Force had made contact with enemy fighters 2 kilometers from the pin patrol and could not push through. Yolanda listened to fragmented reports of casualties and ammunition shortages and requests for air support that weather conditions made impossible. The operations center hummed with tension as officers tracked movements on digital displays and shouted coordinates into handsets. She stood at her assigned station monitoring supply frequencies and feeling more useless than she had ever felt in her life. Sergeant First Class Okonkwo appeared at her shoulder. His face was grim. I just heard from the QRF commander, he said quietly. They're taking heavy fire from elevated positions. The enemy knew they were coming. Yolanda studied the map and traced the route the reaction force had taken. They went through the main valley approach, she said. That is the fastest route, but it is also the most exposed. There is another way. A supply trail we surveyed last month that runs along the northern ridge. It adds distance, but provides cover the entire way. Okonkwo nodded. I remember that trail. You mapped it yourself. She had mapped it during a routine logistics assessment. At the time, it seemed like simple preparation. Now it might be the difference between life and death for soldiers she knew. She made a decision that would either end her career or define it. She turned to Okonkwo. I need a vehicle and a driver. Someone who will not ask questions. He studied her face for a long moment. What you are thinking is a direct violation of orders, he said. Vance told you to stay at your post. She met his eyes without wavering. Yates is out there. Soldiers I've served with for 6 years are out there. I cannot stand here and listen to them die when I know a way to help. Okonkwo exhaled slowly. Then he nodded. I will drive, he said. If we're going to end our careers, we might as well do it together. They slipped out of the operations center during a shift change and reached the vehicle park without being stopped. Okonkwo had requisitioned a supply truck earlier that day for a routine mission that no one would question. They loaded ammunition and medical supplies and drove toward the wire. The guard at the exit point recognized Okonkwo and waved them through without inspection. Within minutes, they were outside the FOB and heading into darkness. The northern supply trail was narrow and treacherous. Okonkwo navigated by moonlight, while Yolanda tracked their position on a handheld GPS unit. They could hear the distant sounds of gunfire echoing off the valley walls. The battle was still raging. After 40 minutes of careful driving, they reached a ridge overlooking the engagement area. Below them, the QRF vehicles sat immobilized behind a rock formation, while muzzle flashes sparked from enemy positions on the opposite slope. Further down the valley, the original patrol was barely visible, pinned in a dried riverbed with no cover and no way out. Yolanda assessed the terrain with eyes trained by thousands of hours studying maps and routes. There she said, pointing to a narrow draw that wound down from their position. That leads to the riverbed. We can approach from behind the patrol's position and reinforce them directly. The QRF is keeping the enemy focused forward. They will not expect anyone coming from a north. Okonkwo checked his weapon. This is insane, he said. She almost smiled. My father would have done the same thing. He laughed softly. Yes, he would have. Let's go. They descended on foot, leaving the truck hidden among boulders. The draw provided cover, but the footing was treacherous. Loose rocks threatened to announce their presence with every step. Yolanda moved with the careful precision she had practiced in countless training sessions. Okonkwo followed close behind. The sounds of battle grew louder as they approached. Rifle fire and shouted commands and the occasional explosion of a grenade. They were close now, close enough to smell the gunpowder and hear individual voices. The patrol came into view through a gap in the rocks. 12 soldiers remained from the original 18. Several were wounded and being treated by a single medic who was clearly overwhelmed. Yates was among the unwounded crouched behind a boulder and firing controlled bursts at enemy positions. Yolanda felt a surge of relief that he was still alive. Then she saw movement on the slope above the patrol. Enemy fighters were working their way around the flank. In minutes, they would have a clear line of fire on the Americans below. The patrol did not see them coming. She reacted on instinct, raised her rifle and engaged the flanking element before they could reach their firing position. Her first shots dropped 2 fighters and sent the others scrambling for cover. Okonkwo added his fire to hers, and for a moment the enemy advance stalled. The patrol below looked up in confusion, trying to identify the source of the unexpected support. Yolanda shouted down to them, "Friendlies on your 6. We are coming to you. Hold your fire north." They scrambled down the final stretch of the draw and slid into the riverbed beside the startled soldiers. A sergeant with blood on his face grabbed Yolanda's arm. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. She pulled free and moved toward the wounded. "Staff Sergeant Achebe," she said. "Logistics. I brought ammunition and medical supplies." The sergeant stared at her for a moment, then laughed with something like disbelief. "Logistics just saved our asses," he said. Okonkwo began distributing ammunition while Yolanda helped the medic stabilize the most critical casualties. The enemy fire had slackened after losing their flanking element, but it would not stay quiet for long. They needed to move. She found the patrol leader, a young lieutenant, with a broken radio and a 1,000-yard stare. "Sir," she said, "I know a route out of here. If we move now, we can link up with the QRF from behind and catch the enemy in a crossfire." The lieutenant looked at her like she had appeared from another world. "Who sent you?" he asked. "No one, sir," she replied. "I sent myself." The words had barely left her mouth when a burst of gunfire erupted from a position they had thought was clear. Okonkwo spun and fell. Yolanda saw the blood spreading across his chest before he hit the ground. She screamed his name and dropped beside him. His eyes found hers, wide with shock but still present. "Go," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Finish this. For your father. For yourself. Go." She pressed her hands against the wound, but the blood kept coming. The medic pushed her aside and took over. There was nothing more she could do for him. Around her, soldiers were shouting and firing, and the battle continued without pause. She looked at Okonkwo one last time. Then she picked up her rifle and stood. The mind quits before the body. Hers would not quit now. Grief would come later. Now, there was only the mission and the soldiers who needed her to function. Yolanda forced herself to breathe and assess and act. The patrol had 11 soldiers still capable of fighting. 3 wounded who could not move on their own. The enemy held a high ground to the south and east. The QRF remained pinned 2 kilometers away. Extraction helicopters could not fly until the weather cleared or the enemy positions were neutralized. They were running out of time and options. She approached the lieutenant, who still seemed paralyzed by the chaos around him. "So," she said firmly, "we need to move now. Staying here means we all die." He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much in too short time. "I lost 6 soldiers already," he said. His voice cracked. "I cannot lose more." Yolanda grabbed his arm and forced him to meet her gaze. "Then let me help you save the ones who are left. I know this terrain. I know where the enemy is weakest. Trust me." The lieutenant stared at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. "What do you need?" he asked. She gathered the able-bodied soldiers and laid out her plan using a stick to draw in the dirt. "The enemy expects us to retreat toward the QRF," she said. "That is why they have concentrated their forces on the southern ridge. But there is a drainage culvert that runs under the old road about 300 meters northeast. It was built for irrigation before the war, big enough to move through in single file. If we can reach, we bypass their entire defensive line and emerge behind their flank." She looked at the faces around her, tired, scared, but listening. "We hit them from behind while the QRF pushes forward. Catch them in a crossfire. In this." A sergeant named Mallory spoke up. "How do you know about this culvert?" Yolanda met his skepticism without flinching. "Because I mapped every supply route in this sector 3 weeks ago. I walked this ground while you were running patrols. I know it better than anyone here." Mallory studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "What about the wounded?" he asked. She had already considered this. 2 soldiers stay with the casualties and the medic. Keep them stable. Keep firing to maintain the illusion that we are all still here. Once we hit the enemy flank, the pressure releases and the QRF breaks through. Then we evacuate everyone together. Private First Class Yates, step forward. I will stay with the wounded sergeant." Yolanda looked at him and saw the fear he was fighting to hide. She also saw determination. He was not volunteering out of cowardice. He was volunteering because protecting wounded soldiers was what she had taught him to value. She reached out and gripped his shoulder. "Keep them alive," she said. "I will come back for you." He nodded and pulled her father's challenge coin from his pocket. "Still got it, Sergeant." She almost smiled. "Bring it home." The able-bodied soldiers moved out in single file with Yolanda on point. The night had grown darker as clouds rolled across the moon. She navigated by memory and instinct, and the faint glow of her GPS screen shielded under her palm. Every step was a calculation, every sound a potential threat. Behind her, 8 soldiers followed in silence, trusting their lives to a logistics sergeant they had barely known existed 12 hours ago. The drainage culvert appeared exactly where she remembered. A concrete pipe, maybe 4 feet in diameter, extending into darkness beneath the crumbled remains of an old road. She signaled a halt and listened. No sound from inside. No indication the enemy knew it existed. She entered first with her rifle up and her senses straining. The pipe was wet and smelled of stagnant water and decay. She moved in a crouch, feeling the walls close around her. Behind her, the soldiers followed one by one. The culvert ran for approximately 200 meters, the longest 200 meters of her life. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every drip of water sounded like footsteps. She focused on breathing and moving and not thinking about what would happen if they were discovered in this concrete tomb with no room to maneuver and nowhere to retreat. Then she saw light ahead, the far end of the pipe opening onto the backside of the enemy position. She halted the column and crept forward alone to assess. The opening was partially concealed by brush and debris. Beyond it, she could see the backs of enemy fighters focused entirely on the riverbed below. They had no idea anyone was behind them. She counted 11 fighters spread across 3 positions. Rifles and at least 1 machine gun. The QRF was visible in the distance, still pinned down and taking fire. This was the moment. Everything she had trained for. Everything she had been denied the chance to prove. It came down to the next few minutes. She returned to the soldiers and assigned targets. Her voice was barely a whisper, but carried absolute authority. "We hit them fast and hard," she said. "No hesitation. No merci. They chose this fight. We're going to finish it." The soldiers nodded. Fear had transformed into focus. They were ready. Yolanda emerged from the culvert first and took position behind a boulder. The others fanned out beside her. She raised her rifle and found her target. A fighter manning the machine gun that had been tearing into American positions for hours. She exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The shot took him through the side of the head. He dropped without a sound. Then the rest of her team opened fire, and the enemy position dissolved into chaos. Fighters spun and fell. Others scrambled for cover only to find themselves exposed from a direction they had never anticipated. The machine gun went silent. The rifle fire faltered, and from the south the QRF surged forward with renewed fury, sensing the tide had turned. The crossfire was devastating. Within 3 minutes the enemy position was overrun. Yolanda moved through the carnage, checking bodies and securing weapons. Her hands were steady. Her mind was clear. Sergeant Mallory appeared beside her. His expression held something she had not seen from any soldier in this unit before. Respect. That was the most insane thing I have ever seen, he said. And I have done 3 deployments. She did not respond. There was no time for recognition. Yates and the wounded were still waiting in the riverbed. Okonkwo was still bleeding out somewhere behind her. The mission was not over yet. She keyed her radio and contacted the QRF commander. Friendly element at enemy position, she reported. Sector clear. Request immediate casevac at grid coordinates to follow. The response came back filled with static and disbelief. Acknowledged. Who is this? She looked out at the valley, where soldiers were finally moving freely for the first time in hours. Staff Sergeant Achebe, she said. Logistics. Now send me those helicopters. The helicopters were 40 minutes out. Weather was clearing, but not fast enough. Yolanda left Sergeant Mallory in command of the secured position and took 3 soldiers back toward the riverbed to link up with the wounded. The route that had taken them through the culvert would take too long in reverse. She chose a direct path down the slope, knowing speed mattered more than concealment now. The enemy was broken, but not destroyed. Scattered fighters could still pose a threat to soldiers who could not move. They found Yates exactly where she had left him. He was crouched over a wounded soldier, applying pressure to a leg wound while the medic worked on another casualty nearby. His eyes widened with relief when he saw her emerge from the darkness. Sergeant Achebe, he said. I heard the shooting change. Knew something happened. She knelt beside him and checked the wounded soldier's condition. Stable, but pale from blood loss. They needed evacuation soon. We broke their line, she said. Helicopters inbound. Start preparing the casualties for transport. She moved to where Okonkwo lay. The medic had done everything possible. Bandages covered his chest, and in 4-line ran into his arm. His breathing was shallow and labored. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that she recognized from her father's descriptions of soldiers who did not have long. She knelt beside him and took his hand. His eyes opened slowly and found her face. You did it, he said. His voice was barely audible. She leaned closer. We did it, she replied. You got me here. He tried to smile, but the effort cost him. His fingers tightened weakly around hers. Your father will be proud, he whispered. I am proud. She felt tears burning in her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Do not talk, she said. Save your strength. The helicopters are coming. He shook his head slightly. We both know, he said. His eyes held hers with an intensity that transcended the physical. Finish what you started, Yolanda. Do not let them stop you. Promise me. She gripped his hand tighter. I promise, she said. A shout from one of the soldiers shattered the moment. Movement on the eastern ridge. She looked up and saw shadows shifting against the skyline. Enemy reinforcements. They had regrouped faster than expected and were moving to flank the riverbed position. The same tactic they had used before. The same tactic that had nearly killed everyone hours ago. She counted at least 15 fighters. Maybe more in the darkness beyond. She made a calculation in seconds. The wounded could not be moved quickly. The soldiers with her were exhausted and low on ammunition. If the enemy reached firing positions above the riverbed, they would have clear shots at everyone below. The helicopters were still 30 minutes away. Someone needed to buy time. Yates, she said, take the others and move the wounded toward the culvert entrance. It provides cover from elevated fire. He started to protest. Sergeant, what are you going to do? She was already moving toward a rocky outcropping that overlooked the eastern approach. I'm going to hold this position, she said. Keep them focused on me. Keep their heads down until the birds arrive. Yates grabbed her arm. That is suicide. You cannot hold off that many alone. She pulled free and met his eyes. I'm not asking for permission, Private. I'm giving you an order. Get those wounded soldiers to cover. Now. He hesitated for one more moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pressed her father's challenge coin in her palm. She had given it to him for protection. Now he was giving it back. "You bring this home yourself, Sergeant," he said. His voice cracked. "Please." She closed her fingers around the worn bronze and nodded. "Go," she said. He went. The outcropping provided decent cover and a clear field of fire across the eastern slope. Yolanda settled into position and checked her rifle. 1 magazine, plus a partial. Maybe 60 rounds total, against 15 or more fighters. The math was not good. She pushed the numbers from her mind and focused on what she could control. Breathing, sight picture, trigger discipline. The fundamentals her father had written about in his handbook. The first fighters appeared in her scope as they crested a small rise 200 meters away. She let them advance until 3 more were visible behind them. Then she fired. The lead fighter dropped. The others scattered for cover. She shifted aim and fired again. Another hit. The remaining fighters began returning fire, but their shots were wild and undisciplined. They had expected easy targets, not a prepared defensive position. For the next 20 minutes, Yolanda held the line. She moved between 3 positions to create the illusion of multiple defenders. She fired in controlled bursts to conserve ammunition. She aimed for fighters who exposed themselves while advancing and punished every mistake they made. The rocky ground around her exploded with impacts. A round grazed her left arm, and another struck her vest hard enough to crack a rib. She kept firing. The enemy tried to flank her twice. Both times she anticipated the movement and cut them down before they could reach cover. Her father's notes had described the psychology of suppressive fire, how sustained resistance broke the will of attackers who expected easy victory. She saw it happening in real time. The fighters became hesitant. Their advances stalled. They began dragging wounded back rather than pushing forward. Her ammunition dropped to single digits. Her arm throbbed where the round had grazed it. Every breath sent pain lancing through her damaged ribs. She thought about Okonkwo lying in the riverbed below, about her father who had given everything for soldiers he loved, about every person who had told her she did not belong in this fight. The anger that had burned quietly for 6 years finally found its release. She heard the helicopters before she saw them, the distinctive thrum of rotors cutting through the night air. The enemy heard them too. Their fire slackened as they realized that reinforcements were arriving and their window was closing. Yolanda watched them begin to withdraw into the darkness. She had done it. She had held long enough. A round struck her thigh as she tried to stand. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. She collapsed against the rocks and pressed her hand against the wound. Blood pulsed hot between her fingers. The helicopters were landing somewhere behind her. She could hear American voices shouting coordinates and calling for medics. The sound seemed very far away. She looked up at the Afghan stars and thought about her father. Wondered if he could see her somehow, if he knew what she had done. The challenge coin was still clutched in her other hand. She brought it to her chest and held it against her heart. "The mind quits before the body," she whispered. Her vision began to blur. But not tonight. Not ever. The last thing she heard before darkness took her was someone calling her name. Colonel Harrison Vance stood at the edge of the rocky outcropping and surveyed the aftermath of a battle he had not witnessed. Spent brass casings littered the ground in 3 distinct clusters. Blood stained the rocks where a soldier had fought and bled and refused to surrender ground. His soldiers had found Staff Sergeant Achebe unconscious and barely breathing when they reached this position. The medics said she had lost nearly half her blood volume. The fact that she was still alive defied medical explanation. He walked the perimeter slowly, taking in every detail. The positioning of her fighting positions showed tactical awareness that rivaled officers with decades more experience. The distribution of enemy casualties on the slope below told a story of disciplined fire and calculated movement. She had created the illusion of a squad with nothing but determination and a rifle that was nearly empty when they found it. First Sergeant Cobb approached from the direction of the landing zone. "Sir," he said, "case vac is complete. All wounded are en route to Bagram." Vance nodded without turning. "What about Sergeant First Class Okonkwo?" Cobb's silence answered before his words did. He did not make it, sir. Died during transport. Vance closed his eyes for a moment. Another name for the memorial wall. Another letter to write. Another family destroyed by this war. The sun rose over the valley and revealed the full scope of what had happened. 17 enemy fighters killed. An ambush broken. A patrol saved. 11 soldiers who would go home to their families because a logistics sergeant had defied orders and done what no one believed she could do. Vance stood in the light of morning and felt something shifting inside his chest. Something he had believed for 30 years beginning to crack. He returned to FOB Sharana and began the process of documenting the engagement. Statements were collected from every soldier involved. The lieutenant who had led the original patrol described how Achebe had appeared from nowhere and taken command when he froze. Sergeant Mallory recounted the flanking maneuver through the culvert with something like awe in his voice. Private First Class Yates broke down twice while describing how she had ordered him to safety and then held an entire enemy force alone so the wounded could be evacuated. The testimony was unanimous. Staff Sergeant Yolanda Achebe had single-handedly turned a disaster into a victory. Vance sat alone in his office that night, reading the statements over and over. His coffee grew cold on the desk beside him. The words blurred together, but the message remained clear. He had been wrong, not just about this soldier, but about everything she represented. He had spent years building walls to keep women out of roles he believed they could not handle. He had convinced himself it was about standards and readiness and protecting the force. But sitting here with the evidence of her courage spread across his desk, he could no longer hide from the truth. It had never been about standards. It had been about fear. Fear that everything he believed about strength and capability and what made a warrior might be incomplete. Major Sinclair knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "Sir," he said, "I need to show you something." He placed a folder on the desk. Vance recognized it immediately. His own correspondence. The memoranda he had written to other commanders advising them to reject female applicants. The paper trail of his quiet campaign against women in combat roles. "I have been documenting everything," Sinclair said. His voice was steady, but his eyes held a challenge. "Every rejected application, every blocked promotion, every transfer request designed to bury a soldier who dared to challenge you." Vance looked at the folder, but did not open it. "Why?" he asked. "Why show me this now?" Sinclair straightened. "Because history is watching, sir. What you do next will define your legacy. You can bury this soldier like you have buried others. Or you can finally do the right thing." The silence stretched between them. Vance thought about the young lieutenant he had been 30 years ago, idealistic and certain that merit was all that mattered in the Army. Somewhere along the way, that certainty had curdled into something uglier. He had stopped seeing soldiers as individuals and started seeing them as categories. Male or female. Infantry or support. Worthy or unworthy. Achebe had shattered those categories with her blood. He picked up the folder and fed it into the shredder beside his desk. Sinclair watched without expression. "That evidence could end your career," Vance said. "It still can if you choose to reconstruct it. But I'm asking you to let me make this right instead." Sinclair considered this for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "I will be watching, sir." He left without another word. Vance flew to Bagram the next morning. The Combat Support Hospital was a maze of corridors and curtained bays filled with the wounded from a dozen different engagements. He found Achebe in the intensive care unit. She was unconscious and connected to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical rhythm. Bandages covered her arm and chest and thigh. Her face was pale but peaceful. He stood at her bedside for a long time without speaking. A nurse approached and asked if he was family. He shook his head. "Her commanding officer," he said. The words felt inadequate. The nurse checked Achebe's vitals and made notes on a chart. "She is stable," the nurse said. "Lost a lot of blood, but she is fighting. Doctor says she has the constitution of someone twice her size." Vance almost smiled. "She has the constitution of a ranger," he said quietly. The nurse gave him a curious look, but said nothing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn green book he had found among her personal effects at the FOB. Her father's Ranger Handbook. He had read through it on the flight to Bagram. The handwritten notes in the margins. The observations about courage and discipline and what it meant to be a warrior. Marcus Achebe had written about his daughter on the final page. A note dated 1 week before his death. She will be better than all of us, it read. She just needs someone to give her the chance. Vance set the handbook on the table beside her bed. Then he leaned close and spoke words he never thought he would say. I am recommending you for the Silver Star, he said. His voice was rough. And when you are healed, your Ranger application will be approved. Personally, he straightened and looked at her still face one last time. I was wrong about you, Staff Sergeant. I was wrong about a lot of things. He turned and walked away before she could wake and see the tears he could no longer hold back. Yolanda opened her eyes to white ceilings and the smell of antiseptic. Machines beeped somewhere beyond her field of vision. Her body felt distant and heavy as if it belonged to someone else. She tried to move her left arm, and pain flared through her like electricity. A nurse appeared beside her bed and spoke in soothing tones. Easy now. You are safe. You are at Landstuhl in Germany. You have been unconscious for 4 days. Germany. The word took time to register. She remembered Afghanistan, the valley, the firefight, Okonkwo falling, the rocky outcropping where she had made her stand. Everything after the helicopters arrived existed only in fragments. Darkness and voices and the sensation of being lifted. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw and dry. The nurse offered ice chips and told her to rest. There would be time for questions later. The questions came over the following days as her condition stabilized. Doctors explained her injuries in clinical terms. 2 gunshot wounds and a fractured rib and significant blood loss. She had required 3 transfusions and surgery to repair arterial damage in her thigh. Full recovery would take months. Her military career might never be the same. She listened and nodded and asked only one question that mattered. What happened to my soldiers? The doctor did not know. He promised to find someone who did. Private First Class Yates arrived at her bedside on the 6th day. He had flown from Afghanistan on emergency leave specifically to see her. His eyes were red and his uniform was wrinkled from travel, but his smile, when he saw her awake, was brighter than anything she had seen in months. Sergeant Achebe, he said, you look terrible. She almost laughed, but her ribs protested. You should see the other guy, she replied. Her voice was still hoarse, but growing stronger. He pulled a chair close and sat down. The smile faded into something more serious. I need to tell you about Sergeant Okonkwo, he said. She had known. Some part of her had known since she regained consciousness. But hearing it confirmed still felt like a blow to the chest. Yates described the transport flight and how Okonkwo had held on longer than anyone expected. He passed just before they landed at Bagram, Yates said. The medics said he kept asking about you. Kept saying your name. Yolanda turned her face toward the window so Yates would not see her tears. She had not cried since her father's funeral 13 years ago. Now the grief she had held at bay for so long broke through, and she wept for Okonkwo and for her father and for all the years she had spent pretending she did not need anyone. Yates waited in silence until she composed herself. Then he reached into his pocket and placed something on her bedside table. Her father's challenge coin. She had been holding it when she lost consciousness. I kept it safe, he said, like you told me to. She picked up the coin and felt its familiar weight in her palm. Thank you, she said, for everything. He shrugged with the awkwardness of youth confronting emotions too large for words. You saved my life, Sergeant. You saved all of us. I am just returning the favor. Letters began arriving after Yates departed. Messages from soldiers she had served with and soldiers she had never met. The story of her stand had spread through the battalion and beyond. A logistics sergeant who had defied orders and charged into combat and held off an enemy force alone while wounded soldiers were evacuated. The details grew more dramatic with each retelling, but the core truth remained. She had done something extraordinary, something that challenged everything people believed about who could be a warrior. Captain Brennan sent a letter from Fort Campbell. The investigation into Colonel Vance had been formally closed, she wrote. Not because the evidence was insufficient, but because Vance himself had requested it. He had submitted a statement accepting responsibility for systematic bias in his command and recommended policy changes to prevent similar patterns in the future. The Army was reviewing his recommendations at the highest levels. Brennan added a personal note at the bottom. "Whatever you did over there, it changed him. I have never seen anything like it." The official notification arrived on her 14th day at Landstuhl. A formal letter informing her that she had been recommended for the Silver Star for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. The ceremony would take place at Fort Campbell upon her return to duty. The presenting officer would be Colonel Harrison Vance. She read the letter 3 times before setting it aside. The medal meant less to her than she had expected. What mattered was the door it represented. The door that had been closed to her for 6 years was finally opening. Not because someone had given her permission, but because she had kicked it down herself. A package arrived the next day from an address she did not recognize. Inside was her father's Ranger handbook, wrapped in protective plastic. A note was tucked inside the front cover. "Staff Sergeant Achabi," it read. "This was found among your personal effects in Afghanistan. I took the liberty of reading it during my flight to Bagram. Your father was a remarkable soldier, but I believe his daughter has surpassed him." The note was unsigned, but she recognized Colonel Vance's handwriting from the rejection letter he had sent 8 months ago. The same hand that had denied her now acknowledged her worth. She opened the handbook to the final page where her father had written his last note. "She will be better than all of us. She just needs someone to give her the chance." Yolanda traced the words with her fingertip and felt something settle into place inside her chest. She had not waited for someone to give her a chance. She had created her own. Her father had believed in her potential. Okonkwo had believed in her purpose. Now she believed in herself. A second document had been included with the medal notification. A single page with the Army Ranger Assessment and Selection Program letterhead. Her application had been approved pending medical clearance. The slot was reserved for the next available class. She would have her chance to earn the tab her father had worn. The tab she had dreamed about since she was 16 years old. All she had to do was heal and report. She folded the letter carefully and placed it beside her father's handbook. Then she pressed the call button for the nurse. "I need to speak with my physical therapist," she said when the nurse arrived. "I want to start rehabilitation today." The nurse looked surprised. "The doctors recommend at least another week of rest." Yolanda shook her head. "I have rested long enough. I have a school to attend and a promise to keep." The nurse studied her face and saw something there that discouraged argument. "I will make the call," she said. Yolanda settled back against her pillows and looked out the window at the German sky. Somewhere beyond those clouds, Fort Campbell waited. A ceremony waited. A future she had fought and bled for waited. She closed her eyes and let herself imagine standing in formation while Colonel Vance pinned a medal on her chest. The same man who had laughed at her application. The same man who had tried to end her career. He would salute her, and she would salute back, and everyone would see what she had always known. She was a soldier. She had always been a soldier. And now the whole world would know it too. Fort Campbell looked different when Yolanda stepped off the plane 6 weeks later. The buildings were the same. The layout was the same. But something fundamental had shifted in the way soldiers looked at her as she walked across the tarmac. Word had traveled faster than she had. The logistics sergeant who had charged into combat and held a position alone against impossible odds. The woman Colonel Vance had mocked who was now receiving the Silver Star from his own hands. She saw recognition in their eyes. Some nodded with respect. Others stared with curiosity. A few smiled like they were seeing a legend come to life. Captain Brennan met her at the terminal with a car and a folder full of paperwork. "Welcome home, Staff Sergeant," she said. "How are the injuries?" Yolanda climbed into the passenger seat and tested her range of motion. The thighs still ached when she pushed too hard, and the ribs complained during sudden movements. But she was walking without assistance, and that was enough. "Getting better every day," she said. "The physical therapists in Germany wanted me to stay another month. I told them I had somewhere to be." Brennan drove toward the main post while updating her on everything that had changed during her absence. The investigation into Vance's conduct had produced unexpected results. Rather than fighting the findings, he had cooperated fully and submitted recommendations for systemic reform. Several other officers implicated in the bias pattern had been quietly reassigned or counseled. The policy changes were already being implemented across the division. More women were applying for combat schools than ever before. Something about your story, Brennan said. It gave people permission to try. They stopped at the battalion headquarters where Yolanda had submitted her original application 8 months ago. The same building where Vance had laughed at her request and signed a rejection. She stood outside for a moment and let the memories wash over her. Then she walked inside. First Sergeant Cobb was waiting in the lobby. He looked older than she remembered. The deployment had aged everyone, but Cobb seemed to carry an additional weight. He approached her and stopped at attention. Staff Sergeant Achebe, he said. Welcome back. She studied his face for any trace of the hostility she had encountered before Afghanistan. She found none. Thank you, First Sergeant, she replied. It is good to be home. He relaxed slightly. I owe you an apology, he said. The words seemed to cost him effort. I doubted you. Thought you were trying to prove a point instead of being a soldier. I was wrong. She considered this for a moment. You are not the only one, she said. What matters is what happens next. He nodded slowly. The colonel wants to see you. He is waiting in his office. The walk down the hallway felt longer than it had 8 months ago. Every step carried the weight of everything that had happened since she last made this journey. Okonkwo was gone. Her body carried permanent scars. Her father's legacy had been honored in ways she never imagined. She reached the door marked Battalion Commander and knocked twice. Enter. Colonel Vance stood behind his desk when she walked in. He did not sit down. Neither did she. The silence between them stretched for several seconds. He looked different too. The arrogance that had defined his bearing was gone. In its place was something more complicated, something that looked almost like humility. Staff Sergeant Achebe, he said. Thank you for coming. She remained at attention. You requested to see me, sir. He gestured toward a chair. Please, seat. This is not an official meeting. She hesitated, then lowered herself into the same wooden chair where she had received a rejection letter. The symmetry was not lost on either of them. Vance sat down across from her. He folded his hands on the desk and seemed to gather his thoughts. I have written a lot of speeches in my career, he said. Award citations, memorial remarks, retirement tributes. But I have never had to find words for something like this. He paused. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about women in combat. I was wrong about what makes a soldier. I built my entire career on assumptions that your actions proved false. She listened without interrupting. This was not about her response. This was about him finding his way to something he needed to say. I cannot undo what I did to your career, he continued. The years I cost you. The opportunities one blocked. The rejection letters I signed without ever really seeing you. But I can make sure it does not happen to anyone else. The policy recommendations I submitted are just the beginning. I am requesting a transfer to training and doctrine command after this deployment. I want to spend whatever time I have left in this uniform changing the systems I helped build. He met her eyes directly. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am not sure I deserve it. But I wanted you to know that what you did changed more than one battle. It changed me. Yolanda absorbed his words and weighed them against everything she had experienced. The mockery, the obstruction, the years of being told she did not belong. This man had been the architect of her frustration. Now he sat before her diminished and genuine and asking for nothing except to be heard. I did not do it for you, she said finally. I did it for the soldiers who needed help. I did it for Sergeant Okonkwo who believed in me when no one else did. I did it for my father, who never got to see me become what he knew I could be. She leaned forward. But if what I did helps the next woman who walks into this office with an application that makes you uncomfortable, then it was worth every scar. Vance nodded slowly. That is fair, he said. More than fair. He stood, and she stood with him. The ceremony is tomorrow at 0900, he said. Division Commander will be present along with media from 3 networks. It will be public in a way that neither of us can control. She understood what he was saying. The story would be told whether they shaped it or not. At least this way the truth would be part of the narrative. She turned to leave, then stopped at the door. Sir, she said. He looked up. My ranger slot. Is it still reserved? For the first time since she had known him, Colonel Vance smiled. It was small and tired but genuine. "Class begins in 4 months," he said. "Medical clearance permitting. I expect to see you there." She nodded once. "You will, sir." She walked out of his office and into a hallway filled with soldiers who had heard rumors and wanted to see her for themselves. She passed them without stopping. Tomorrow would bring the ceremony and the cameras and the public recognition she had never sought. But tonight she had somewhere else to be. The post cemetery was quiet in the evening light. She found the memorial stone for soldiers who had died during the deployment. Okonkwo's name was already engraved among them. She knelt in the grass and placed her father's challenge coin at the base of the stone. "I kept my promise," she said quietly. She stayed until the sun went down. Then she rose and walked toward tomorrow. The morning sun rose sharp and golden over Fort Campbell as 800 soldiers assembled on the parade field. Yolanda stood in the front row of the formation, wearing her dress uniform with every ribbon and badge she had earned over 7 years of service. The uniform felt different now, heavier with meaning. She had ironed it twice the night before and polished her boots until they reflected the sky. Her father had taught her that presentation mattered, that how you wore the uniform showed how seriously you took the privilege of wearing it. Camera crews from 3 networks had set up positions along the perimeter. Journalists with notepads stood beside photographers with long lenses. The story had grown beyond anything Yolanda had anticipated. A female logistics sergeant who defied orders and single-handedly saved a patrol in Afghanistan. The army had tried to keep the details contained, but soldiers' talk and the truth had spread faster than any official narrative could control. Now the world was watching. Colonel Harrison Vance walked to the podium at precisely 0900. His uniform was immaculate and his bearing was straight, but Yolanda noticed something different in his expression. The rigidity that had always defined him had softened into something more human. He adjusted the microphone and looked out at the assembled formation. Behind him, the division commander and several general officers sat in folding chairs. This was not a routine award ceremony. This was a moment that would be remembered. Vance began with the standard language, the official citation that described dates and locations and actions taken under enemy fire. He read the words clearly and without embellishment. Staff Sergeant Yolanda Achebe distinguished herself by exceptionally valorous conduct in the face of hostile enemy forces. Upon learning that fellow soldiers were trapped and under heavy attack, she voluntarily departed the safety of the forward operating base and moved to reinforce their position. Through her tactical expertise and personal courage, she enabled the rescue of 11 wounded soldiers and the successful extraction of an entire patrol element. He paused and looked up from the paper. Then he set it aside. "That is what the citation says," he continued. His voice carried across the silent field. "But it does not tell the whole story. It does not tell you that 8 months ago I laughed at this soldier's application to Ranger assessment. It does not tell you that I spent 2 years actively blocking her career because I believed women did not belong in combat roles. It does not tell you that I was wrong." A murmur rippled through the formation. The journalists leaned forward. Vance continued without hesitation. Staff Sergeant Achebe did not save those soldiers because someone gave her permission. She saved them despite being told she could not. She saved them because she understood something that I had forgotten. That courage is not determined by gender. That excellence is not limited by prejudice. That the measure of a warrior is not what category they fit into, but what they do when lives are on the line. He turned and looked directly at Yolanda. She met his gaze without flinching. "I mocked her application," he said. "Today, I am honored to present her with a Silver Star, and I am humbled to announce that her application to Ranger assessment has been approved. She will attend the next available class with my full endorsement and support." He gestured for her to approach the podium. She marched forward with precise steps and stopped at attention before him. The division commander rose and handed Vance a small blue box. Inside lay the Silver Star medal gleaming against dark velvet. Vance lifted it carefully and pinned it to her chest just above her heart. The medal was cool against her uniform. The weight was slight, but the significance was enormous. Vance stepped back and rendered a salute. She returned it crisply. For a moment, they stood frozen in that exchange. The man who had tried to end her career saluting the woman who had proven him wrong. The cameras captured everything. The formation was dismissed, and soldiers surged forward to congratulate her. Hands reached out to shake hers, and voices offered praise and admiration. She accepted it all with grace while searching the crowd for the faces that mattered most. Private First Class Yates pushed through and wrapped her in a hug that made her ribs ache. "You did it, Sergeant," he said. "You actually did it." She hugged him back. "We did it," she replied. "All of us." Captain Brennan appeared with paperwork that needed signatures. Even moments of triumph required administration. Yolanda signed where indicated and thanked Brennan for everything she had done behind the scenes. The JAG officer shrugged. "You did the hard part," she said. "I just made sure the regulations worked in your favor for once." The crowd eventually thinned, and the cameras packed up, and the parade field returned to its usual emptiness. Yolanda stood alone in the afternoon light and let the reality settle into her bones. She had done what everyone said was impossible. She had changed minds that seemed unchangeable. She had honored her father and Okonkwo and every soldier who had ever been told they did not belong. But the journey was not over. It was just beginning. She walked to the post cemetery one more time. Okonkwo's memorial stone caught the fading sunlight. She knelt and touched the engraved letters of his name. "I got my tab slot," she said quietly. "Ranger assessment in 4 months. I'm going to earn it. For you. For my father. For everyone who comes after me." She paused. "Thank you for believing in me when I was not sure I believed in myself. Thank you for keeping your promise to my father. I will make you both proud." She rose and turned toward the parking lot. A young female soldier stood near the entrance watching her with wide eyes. The soldier wore the insignia of a supply specialist, the same MOS Yolanda had carried for 7 years. Their eyes met, and Yolanda saw something familiar in that gaze. Hunger, determination, the same fire that had burned in her own chest for as long as she could remember. She walked over and stopped in front of the young soldier. The private snapped to attention. "At ease," Yolanda said. "What is your name?" "Private First Class Amara Osei, Sergeant." "Nigerian name." Yolanda smiled. "Let me guess. Someone told you that women cannot go to Ranger School." Osei's jaw tightened. "My recruiter said I should focus on realistic goals, Sergeant." Yolanda nodded slowly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her father's challenge coin. The same coin that had traveled from Fort Benning to Afghanistan and back. The same coin that had rested against her heart while she bled on a rocky outcropping 10,000 miles away. She pressed it into Osei's palm. "Realistic is whatever you decided," as she said. "Come find me when you are ready to start training." She walked away without looking back. Behind her, Private Osei stood motionless, staring at the coin in her hand. Then she looked up at Okonkwo's memorial stone. Then at the retreating figure of Staff Sergeant Yolanda Achebe. Something shifted in her expression, something that looked like the beginning of a dream. If this story moved you, I hope you will share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us about your favorite moment or character. Tell us about someone you know who had to fight twice as hard for half the recognition. Or tell us about the moment you decided to pursue something everyone said was impossible. Your stories matter just as much as this one. The sun set over Fort Campbell. Somewhere on the post, a young soldier opened her phone and began searching for Ranger assessment requirements. The cycle was beginning again, and this time the door was already open.